Well, then we are back with more understandings from the Renewed Covenant, from the Aramaic English translation of the Word. And it's always important emphasizing the importance of these scriptures being translated from the Hebraic Aramaic understanding. And then you can find many areas where Shaul then he was involved ever since he started with his ministry. He was functioned with the 7 spirits of Elohim. It's truly amazing the number of functions he began, and then many areas where he began to teach the people, the Gentiles, and then his own countrymen. And he was then saying the word impartation. He was simply desiring of praying with his set-apart believers, set-apart countrymen, so then they would be functioned in Ruach HaKodesh. As we can remind ourselves from the time he was then involved with the healing of the governor of the island, as he shipwrecked then in Malta, then he did understand that the governor was then sick, and he came over and he healed him. So then he began the understanding of healing, and then in many cases he rose people from the dead as a form of showing the miracle. And then words of wisdom he taught from the instructions. Word of knowledge he gave understandings, practical understandings where people were at. He also prophesied. He had discerning of spirits, such as in Ephesians. And then also he likewise was then involved in tongues, interpretation of tongues. That's why later then in Corinthians he said, if a person would then speak in many tongues but then would not encourage, or having every function and then would not encourage other people, then the work would be in vain. So then when you understand the idea of Shaul then delegating responsibilities, and those were normal responsibilities expected to the set apart to do their duties, but he himself was simply directing them, and he was praying with them as then the set apart people received the Ruach HaKodesh, and then they began to function. The Gentiles, they had no part in it. The Gentiles, they were only under the anointing at times, and they would praise Elohim in their own tongue or in their own language. They were not functioning themselves. So then, when you begin to understand the 7 functions of Elohim, you will find Shaul then performing each of those while the camps were not around. Then later at the end of his ministry, you will find then the camps and then the dependency upon each other, each of them being functioned. So it's very interesting because you can understand then step by step of Shaul then forming and founding then the camps. Try to understand that he was not only relating himself with the congregations. The congregations, when he first came, later became camps. However, outside the camps, the congregations yet existed. But then the Goyim or Gentiles, they only come to share their faiths. And then they would visit at the camp very often for further teaching. As you can understand from the proper translation of the scriptures in Acts, Cornelius, he simply received the further instructions after the Hebrew brothers prayed. It never changed ever since. Why never changed? Because only half of the prophets and half of the Torah were completed. The second portion is dependent upon the second service, and then the second service was able to perform because of the completion of the first. So then, understanding these areas, then it's kind of interesting, because you then find then Shaul exercising the 7 functions, as the Mashiach also functioned 7 spirits at the same time. Have this in mind. What Shaul taught, it was previously taught and much in depth than Shaul. The problem was, after his ascension, there was a huge persecution, as we can read, and then the Hebrews, they were dispersed. But there were many Megillas and many of the explanations previously, and then Shaul simply later, he then began to explain what those were. So then the whole foundation of then the apostles, not the apostles, but those do not exist, but then the Shaliachim came from the Hebraic, Aramaic understanding, and the foundations then were laid. So in every Megillah that you read, for instance, then Ephesians, Colossians, and then Thessalonians, Philippians, each of those started out as congregations, but then they turned into a camp. Then, much later, when Shaul was gone, and Yohanan then was in the mainland, protected in a camp, and those people in the camp, they were very, very highly functioned. That's why the visions, they came, because Yohanan was protected from every angle of the spiritual realm, and then the visions came in very clear. Because it was the end of a period of time where then the camps, they were in their utmost. Try to understand, the persecution was always around. But then when the camps were formed, they were the stabilization of the region. Quite some time later, then the persecution became more evident, but then the camps, they were in their utmost by the time of Yohanan. That's why he was himself then found in a camp. The only reason why he was caught is because he was outside of the camp, prophesying upon nations, kingdoms, princes, as he was told to do. Then later he was sent to the island, but by that time his role was already revealed. So then other brothers had to take on his responsibility, and they went out and they did the same. The third role of vengeance when Yohanan received was not exclusive for him to do it. Other people also began the teaching of the understanding of the revelation and the judgment to come. Because the judgment to come era is related with when a person dies without the Mashiach, a person, then the soul goes into torment until the closing of the age. That's when there is the final judgment, but the person is already judged while a person is alive. However, he is then prophesying that in the future won't have any escape. That's why the nations were afraid. And that's why then Yohanan was sent to the island, and from the island he never wrote. So it's kind of interesting because places in a very interesting position because only 0.5% is related with the Gentiles. The rest of it is related with the set apart believers, the Hebrews, performing their duties as they were expected. Much higher responsibility. That's why the Gentiles, they don't interfere, because they have a very tiny percentage of the responsibility other than taking care of themselves, and most of the time is related to what they should not to do versus what they should do. They should not pray, they should not worship. Those areas are extremely important, and they should exercise only those areas when the set apart Hebrews are around. Because false worship and false prayers, they draw evil spirits. And then the Gentiles were taught not to do it because it requires the very presence of Elohim while they do so. So the Gentiles are protected, and also the set apart. So they can continue on with the Gentile level in faith, and then the set apart being then set apart. That's why Shaul said, whatsoever is done, let it be done orderly. But then the order part of it has a tiny percentage of Gentiles involvement, and then more than 99% then set apart involvement. But then Shaul also prophesied in the future those areas would be then scandalized. It would be so badly twisted that each side would not understand what each other is doing. So the set apart should never be involved with the trades of the world. They should be in their camps being provisioned with. The Gentiles, they provide whatsoever is required for them to be in their camps and then be functioned. The Gentiles outside, they don't do any ministry. They only work, they do their work, and they take care of the trades of the world in exchange for the ministrations of Ruach HaKodesh through the set apart on the benefit of the Gentiles. Then it works perfectly. At the moment is extremely twisted. For instance, synagogues by themselves, they make no sense. Churches by themselves, they make no sense. What does make sense is the second service, and those should be in camps, and then the Gentiles should provide for the set apart, because the very presence of Elohim himself is with them. And vengeance is coming, so we understand from the 20th chapter and the 9th verse that the camps then by that time they are around. So we should engage ourselves in returning of what was before, so then we can prepare ourselves for the future, because the next 40 years are going to be very detrimental. As then Brother Joseph, he was then preparing Egypt for the huge famine that would come. So then these next 4 years are going to be extremely crucial, and we must prepare our country for what's coming in the future. Because our country is part of the prophetic timeline of Revelation. Please stay tuned, much more coming up.